Welcome to That Final Girl Life. It's your new favourite final girl here, taking you through the horrors and out the other side to find out what life is really like after the movie ends. I can't believe I need to say this, but apparently it's a whole thing now. I am an actual real live human being, not an AI. I physically write all my scripts, I watch the movies at least twice before I do an episode on them. Any resources I use, like other people's articles or studies which I've found helpful, will be in the show notes. You might occasionally get a cameo in the background from my cat. She's not an AI either. In this episode, we'll be discussing the incredibly tense psychological sci-fi horror The Invisible Man and its badass final girl, Cecilia. Please be aware that there will be spoilers throughout the episode. If you haven't seen The Invisible Man and you don't want to know what happens before you do, this is your warning. I found the opening scene much less impactful watching it the second time when I knew what was going to happen, so I'd recommend watching it before listening to this. In this episode, I'll be talking about domestic violence, people misusing their power, people not believing victims, being locked up on a psych ward, psychosis, misogyny, the fear of going mad, and of course, PTSD. Ready? Settle down somewhere cozy, and don't forget to surround yourself with coffee grounds, flour, or paint so you can check you're definitely alone while we're discussing The Invisible Man. Yesterday, upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. This is Antigonish by Hughes Mearns, written in 1899 about a ghost haunting the stairwell of a house in Nova Scotia. Before I knew it was a ghost poem, I assumed it was about trauma. How people from the past can haunt us even though they're no longer physically present. I suppose that's kind of what a ghost is. Antigonish sums up a lot of the plot of The Invisible Man, certainly the first half before the audience comes to realise what's actually going on. Watching it for the second time in preparation for this podcast, I found I had to cast my mind back to my first watch, trying to remember how it had felt, because it's very much a movie that relies on building tension in a can't quite tell what's happening sort of way. The film opens with a view of a house on a cliffside near the ocean. It's beautiful and haunting before we even get inside. But then we see the bedroom and the tension immediately rockets up. Our final girl, Cecilia, played by Elizabeth Moss, a person endowed with brilliant acting skills and questionable politics, is lying awake in bed next to a man. She proceeds to get up, go downstairs, get dressed and leave the house, saying goodbye to her dog Zeus on the way. So far, so normal, right? Oh, but it isn't. I felt this scene right down in my core. If you've lived in an abusive household, you will know that abject terror you feel any time you try to do something that might get you killed. The way she moves through the house, the way she looks at her phone, the spike of fear when the car alarm goes off. Honestly, if you know what that feels like in real life, you might find you don't seem to be breathing by the end of the scene. So we're immediately set up with the concept that Cecilia is running from her abusive husband, a theory that gets confirmed when she jumps in her sister's car, a ride she has obviously prearranged, and her husband bursts from the trees and rages at the window, screaming and banging it so hard that it breaks. Cecilia gets away. She's still pretty shaken. So are we. She goes to stay with her friend James, who happens to be a police officer, which in this instance is probably not a bad shout. James is a single father to his adorable teenage daughter Sydney, who wants to go to fashion school. We see that Cecilia is terrified to go outside. Even though her husband doesn't know James, she's scared he'll find out where she's staying. But James gradually coaxes her to get as far as the end of the driveway before she races back indoors, gasping for breath. Then her sister Emily turns up with some shocking news. Adrian, Cecilia's abusive husband, is dead. He has died by suicide in his beautiful mansion and has left her $5 million, subject to her not committing any crimes and remaining of sound mind. The will's executor is Adrian's brother Tom, who isn't the warmest person by any means, but seems to be somewhat on Cecilia's side. Adrian was a brilliant inventor specialising in optics, and he had a lot of money, some of which is now offered to Cecilia. Cecilia accepts the money, who wouldn't, and life goes on. She creates a college fund for Sydney, who is over the moon. But Cecilia is still feeling ill at ease. This makes sense. She's been through a horrible time with her husband, and now he's died, hinting that her leaving is the reason for his suicide. Even though she knows he's dead, it's hard for Cecilia to shake the feeling that he's still watching her. This is the brilliance of this film. It could end up going any number of different ways. I remember the first time I watched it, getting to this point, and thinking that I wasn't sure if this was a descent into madness story, a ghost story, or something else entirely. I tried to go into films knowing as little about them as possible, because I like my reactions to be entirely my own. It's been hellish this year not being able to get to the cinema to see Obsession or Backrooms, because avoiding spoilers is so hard. But anyway, back to Cecilia. In the middle of the night we see her sleeping, and then the duvet being rapidly pulled off her. We see flashes of light, as if from a camera. Cecilia wakes up and stares at a scary, shadowy figure at the end of the bed, which we soon learn is just a mannequin for Sydney's fashion projects. Cecilia gets out of bed and finds the duvet on the floor. Picking it up, she stares at an armchair as if she believes someone is sitting in it. She throws the duvet over the chair, but it settles normally, and we can see her berate herself internally for being afraid of nothing at all. She picks up the end of the duvet and pulls it back to bed with her, except that it stops. It's caught on nothing? But there are visible impressions in the duvet on the floor where we can see someone's footprints. In other words, someone invisible seems to be standing on the duvet. Cecilia screams. Sydney, who had been sleeping in bed beside her, wakes up. James rushes into the room, turns on the light, and checks the whole house. No one is there. Adrian will haunt you if you let him, he tells Cecilia. Don't let him. The next day, Cecilia's job interview is ruined when she opens her portfolio and discovers it's empty. This, combined with the events of last night, freaks her out so much that she passes out in front of the interviewer. A trip to the hospital and some blood tests reveal that Cecilia had a large amount of diazepam in her system, which is confusing because she doesn't take them. Later on, Cecilia learns that this isn't the only surprise. Adrian had also tampered with her birth control and managed to get her pregnant. We cut to a scene in a boardroom. Cecilia and James sit on one side of the table, Adrian's brother Tom on the other. James evidently doesn't know why Cecilia wanted to talk to Tom, but he's there for moral support regardless. As Cecilia begins talking, though, James looks more and more concerned. Cecilia is telling Tom that Adrian has found a way to make himself invisible and is stalking her. Tom, in a first proper moment of apparent empathy, tells Cecilia that Adrian was controlling and awful to him as well. He was relieved by his brother's death, he admits to her. Echoing James's earlier statement, he tells Cecilia not to let Adrian win by bringing him back to life. Increasingly desperate for someone to believe her, Cecilia goes to see her sister Emily. But Emily won't let her in. She's furious with Cecilia because of an email she received from her that morning, calling her suffocating and saying she wants to cut her off. Cecilia desperately tries to explain that it was Adrian who sent the email, but Emily closes the door in her face, telling her to go get psychiatric help. Disbelieved by everyone, Cecilia curls up in the fetal position once she's back in James's house and cries in abject despair. She has nowhere left to turn, she feels, and no one will believe her. Sydney finds her and suggests a girls' night in to cheer her up. Cecilia smiles, but as she goes to stand up, Sydney is hit, hard, by a blow to the side of her head and knocked to the ground. James races in to see what's going on, at which point Sydney says Cecilia hit her, and Cecilia says it was Adrian. We can see James regretting his decision to bring this mad woman into his house. He tells her she has to go, but in the meantime, he and Sydney leave the house. Cecilia, left alone with only the invisible Adrian still there, sits against a wall holding a large kitchen knife. She's spilled coffee grounds all around her, so that she will know if Adrian comes towards her. After a while, she has an idea and calls his phone. It rings above her head. That classic horror film location, second only to the basement. It's in the attic. Cecilia goes up there where she finds the phone, along with a set of keys, photos of her and Sydney asleep in bed, and her portfolio which was missing when she went to the interview. The phone buzzes. "Surprise," it says. Racing back to the hatch, she throws white paint in front of her, and Adrian's outline appears in the hole. This was the moment, watching it the first time, when I realised she was telling the truth. I suppose we could have still been seeing a hallucination, but the next scene confirmed that Adrian was actually there, because he beats her up in the kitchen. Elizabeth Moss, and presumably also her stunt double, does some fantastic acting in this scene. She manages to get away from her invisible attacker, and asks Emily to meet her in a restaurant. She wants to speak somewhere public, she says. Emily agrees. This was, for me, the most shocking scene in the entire movie. Cecilia is visibly not okay, Emily is visibly stressed, but willing to hear her out. Just as Cecilia is about to tell her what Adrian is doing, she has learned that he's built an invisibility suit and is wearing it to attack her. A knife floats next to Cecilia, then swiftly races across to Emily, slitting her throat, and then ends up in Cecilia's hand almost before we know what's happened. Obviously, everyone in the restaurant thinks she's killed her sister. What's the alternative? An invisible man did it and framed you. Of course, the police are called, and they take her to a secure mental facility, aka a psych ward. She tries to tell them that Adrian is still in the room with them. Predictably, they don't believe her. Eventually, she manages to escape, but Adrian is close behind her, killing baffled security staff as he goes. Cecilia steals a car and races to James's house, which Adrian has beaten her to, and has attacked both Sydney and James. Cecilia saves the day by spraying a fire extinguisher to illuminate Adrian and then shooting him several times. But when she and James peel off the mask, they find it is Tom behind it. This, of course, makes James, along with pretty much everyone else, believe that Tom was the invisible man the whole time. But Cecilia knows better. She calls Adrian, who has been found alive, tied up in his basement, apparently by Tom. He wants her back, he tells her, and so she suggests dinner. Cecilia goes to Adrian's house and asks him to just admit to her what he has done. Adrian refuses. Cecilia, of course, is wearing a wire, on the other end of which sits James in a car nearby. Saying she's going to freshen up, Cecilia leaves the room. A few minutes later, we see Adrian slit his own throat, still sitting at the dinner table. His arm moves jerkily, as if he's not in full control. Moments after that, Cecilia enters the room and begins crying and screaming. She dials 911 and tells them Adrian has killed himself. James, hearing this, leaves the car and races towards the house, running into Cecilia on the way. She smiles as she tells him that it's all okay now. Glancing into her bag, we see along with James the invisibility suit she has taken from the house. Well, she's survived, and she has, as they say, neutralised the threat herself, so she knows he's not coming back. She's been vindicated. The good thing about this, other than that she's no longer in danger, is that she trusts herself and her instincts. The bad thing is that she's been repeatedly taught, via this experience, that she can't trust anyone else, even people who genuinely have her best interests at heart, like James. She's also learned that she's no one's top priority. She might have been Emily's if they'd been able to mend that relationship, but Emily is dead. She's high on James's list for sure, but Sydney, completely appropriately, will always come first. So she knows she ultimately only has herself to rely on. She has to be her own safety net. Luckily, she has a ton of money and an invisibility suit, so certain things aren't an issue, but a lot of other things probably will be. So where does she end up? First, we have the question of the pregnancy. It's not very far along, and I'm pretty sure she'd decide to have an abortion, given that she didn't want to be pregnant in the first place. I think the main things that will continue to haunt Cecilia and have an impact on her life will be to do with her relationships with other people, especially, but not exclusively, when it comes to romance. This will be familiar to anyone who's survived a similarly life-threatening relationship. It can be hard to open yourself up in that way again. People will try to be helpful and say things like, "It's okay, they're not all like that, of course they love you for who you are," and so on. But if they haven't been in that situation, then they just don't know what it's like to try to trust someone again. Not only that, but even the logic of trusting again doesn't always make sense after something like this has happened. Cecilia is a smart, strong woman who is more than capable of taking drastic action where necessary, as shown by what she does at the very end of the film. It's one of the reasons why The Invisible Man is one of my favourite movies. It shows that it doesn't matter how clever or capable you are. There are times when we can all end up in situations where we're at risk, and societal factors make some of us less believable than others. Having said that, there are certain populations who are more likely to end up in abusive relationships than others. These include, among others, people who have been abused as children, people who suffer from depression or PTSD, people with anxious or avoidant attachment styles, and people who don't have much of a social support network. Let's think about these in relation to Cecilia. We don't know much about Cecilia's background, other than that her relationship with her sister has always been a bit thorny. The fact that she's ended up in a violent relationship in adulthood points towards some possible abuse in childhood. There are lots of studies linking child abuse with adult re-victimization. Interestingly, and counter to what many people expect, this includes all types of abuse pretty much equally, including emotional abuse and neglect, not just sexual or physical abuse. We don't know whether Cecilia suffers from depression, but she will certainly have some post-traumatic stress symptoms after the experiences she's just had. This is why some people disagree with the D in PTSD. It stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and yet disorder seems to imply that it shouldn't be happening, whereas being traumatized by a traumatic event is just logical. Again, we don't know Cecilia's original attachment style, but a lot of psychologists these days believe that attachment styles can shift throughout life, with or without direct intervention. Attachment styles refer to how you learned to be in relationships with others when you were very, very young. The theory goes that your first ever attachments, usually but not necessarily within your family of origin, will have a lasting impact on how you are in relationships. I always used to hate the attachment theory days in the various psychology and psychotherapy courses I've done, because they seemed so fatalistic. But as more research comes out, people are understanding that humans, even adult humans, are more neurologically changeable than we thought, which means there's arguably more of a chance to change your original way of relating than the people who first came up with attachment theory might have expected. In Cecilia's case, this might actually work against her. Regardless of her initial attachment style, she's just come out of a relationship where she absolutely couldn't trust her partner. And not only that, but even the people around her who loved her, Emily, James, Sydney, can't be trusted to believe her and always have her back either. Which brings us to the social support system. She doesn't really have one. She has James and Sydney, of course, and I imagine James will be doing whatever he can to continue supporting her. But the events with Adrian will have driven a bit of a wedge between them, and even if this is still a good relationship, it's probably not one that Cecilia fully trusts. The strongest risk factor for intimate partner violence, unfortunately, is previous relationship violence. This includes not just physical violence, but also emotional victimization by an intimate partner. Unfortunately, Cecilia has experienced a lot of both. Like I said before, Cecilia is smart, and she's smart in the intellectual sense as well as being intuitive. I can imagine her having heard some of these statistics before, and then looking up things like rates of re-victimization and deciding to stay single. Reading some of the research that's out there, she might decide that she can still have a fun sex life even without the intimacy part, as long as she stays in control. Violence from people you're not in an ongoing relationship with is much more likely to happen if there's alcohol or drugs involved. Of course, this doesn't mean violence never happens when you're sober during casual sexual encounters, nor does it excuse perpetrators attacking people who are too drunk or high to either consent or say no. But it does demonstrate specific risk factors, and I can imagine Cecilia weighing all of this up in her mind, deciding to stay on her own, but allowing a certain degree of sexual satisfaction into her life as long as nobody gets too close to her. Of course, she'll also have her fantastic guard dog, Zeus. Over the last decade, there's been a marked increase in people, especially women, getting dogs for protection. Unfortunately, it's an unregulated industry, and the lack of training a lot of these dogs have, coupled with being bred for aggression, has meant that there's also been an increase in dog attacks. Zeus, by all accounts, seems to be a wonderful dog, and given that he was presumably bought by Adrian, he's probably a fully trained guard dog rather than a randomly acquired puppy. So Cecilia has her home sorted, she's rich enough to buy one, her sex life is okay, and she has ongoing companionship in the form of her Doberman. Unlike our final girl from the previous episode, I reckon Cecilia will probably be doing alright in life overall. She has enough money to tide her over, and let's not forget the invisibility suit which she can whip out if need be. What a useful thing to have on hand. I doubt she'd be satisfied with a life of leisure, and she seemed pretty passionate in her job interview before it all unravelled because of Adrian's actions. She's probably joined an architecture firm and negotiated the setup she wants. So life's pretty great overall for our final girl, right? Sure, but there will still be certain things that might get to her. And this is what makes Cecilia a great example of exactly the kind of final girl I started this podcast to talk about. Capable, strong, confident, assertive, but still affected in an ongoing way by her experiences. The number one thing it will have affected, probably, is her relationships. We've talked a bit about that in terms of sex and romance, and also the specific relationship with her friend James. But friendships, and even casual acquaintanceships in general, are going to be a challenge too. Let's recap Cecilia's relational experiences throughout the course of the film to find out more. Cecilia knows exactly how far a controlling man will go to get what he wants. She also understands that people will misuse things they're working on for their own ends, something a lot of people seem surprised by, which always annoys me. As a survivor of the horrors, I often find non-perpetrators' shocked outrage almost as annoying as the acts of the perpetrators themselves. Often, victims will try to tell people something is happening to them. People disbelieve them because they don't think it happens, or don't believe it happens to people like them, and then when it comes out that the terrible things have in fact been done, they get to act all shocked and surprised. It drives me fucking insane. Some recent examples of this kind of outrage include a study conducted by the Institute for Justice, a non-profit organisation in the US, which showed that police officers are using tracking technology to stalk current and ex-partners, an NHS probe into the number of presumed unauthorised people accessing the files of the little boy who was attacked by crocodiles recently in a UK zoo, a general investigation by the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland showing that police officers frequently misuse their powers for sexual purposes, a police officer attempting to access a sexual video of someone from a live investigation, and I quote, to show the lads, on WhatsApp. And those are just a few examples from the past month. Cecilia has learned in the hardest possible way that people will not believe just how bad other people can be. It shatters their idea of upper middle class respectability to think that a rich man, a scientist at that, might go to such lengths to abuse his wife. She's also experienced people underestimating her lack of safety. Even James did this when the perpetrator was in his own child's bedroom. Now, admittedly, an invisible perpetrator does sound like a stretch, but actually, in the context of the world of the movie, it isn't. And I went to a talk about 15 years ago in which a physicist spoke about how optics are advancing to be able to create invisibility cloaks, so who knows? They were talking about military uses, naturally, but still, Adrian's invisibility isn't completely outside of all possible bounds. She's also been told, over and over again, that she shouldn't trust her own mind. The great thing about Cecilia, in my opinion, is that she's never listened to this. Even right at the very end, when James is still unsure whether it was Adrian or Tom who was behind the whole thing, Cecilia backs herself. I love that for her. I just wish it wasn't necessary. Examples of people telling her this include James's statement, Adrian will haunt you if you let him, don't let him. Tom's statement, don't let him win by bringing him back to life. And Cecilia herself says it too. This is what he does. He makes me feel like I'm the crazy one. Even in the final showdown, Adrian is demonstrating this very dynamic when he talks about how she needs him to keep herself together. Cecilia cries and goes along with it because that's the only option open to you when you're faced with that level of barefaced controlling narcissism. But even when directly exposed to the cause of her current trauma, she manages to keep that kernel of self-belief, which is so necessary if you're going to survive something like this and thrive later on. But even though Cecilia backs herself and will presumably continue doing so, she's become used to other people not backing her. She'll probably become quite closed off to other people, cagey about all sorts of things for reasons they won't understand. I remember, during the only corporate job I had, being constantly teased for my enigmatic responses to the most basic of questions. I didn't mind being teased, but sometimes they got annoyed, and I wanted to tell them that they just didn't understand what they were asking. I wrote a song about this once, when someone says, "How was your weekend?" but your weekend involved some kind of horrendous re-traumatization event involving reporting a parent for child trafficking, while simultaneously trying to save them from a drug overdose. Sometimes you just don't want to go into that. So you lie and say it was fine, but then you get cagey when people press for details. I've had colleagues get properly annoyed with me for this. So if you know someone who's a bit weird about giving details, please bear in mind that it might not just be some weird, irritating quirk. They might have some really complicated shit going down which they just can't bear to talk about, and which isn't any of your business anyway. I can hear you thinking, okay, but what's the likelihood that Anya from the marketing department is being stalked by an invisible presence? Or that Spencer and the dev team spent their weekend giving statements to the police about a family member's drug ring? And that is, literally, my whole point. The likelihood is pretty high. Not necessarily of those things specifically, of course, but that something is going on, and that something might be horrific and involve other people and complex relationships. The number of clients I've spoken to who have felt so alone in these kinds of conversations at work indicates to me that there's probably at least one other person in their respective companies or departments who understands, something I've said to them at times. An amusing illustration of this from my own life was when I was talking to a new acquaintance at a business dinner, and when she asked, "What do your parents do?" I decided I was too exhausted, and, to be honest, slightly too drunk, to lie or be cagey. So instead I just replied with, "My dad's a criminal and my mother's in a cult." To which she, to my amused surprise, replied, "Oh my god, same." But that's a story for another time. So, Cecilia's doing okay, her life is pretty good overall, but relationships are a challenge. Well, okay, we can live with that, right? Sure. Will there be other, perhaps less obvious, things that affect her day to day? Almost certainly. People talk a lot about triggers these days. There are trigger warnings on lots of things: books, films, podcasts. I gave some content notes at the top of this episode so that people could choose whether or not to engage. However, the meaning of the word trigger has changed and softened over time. Originally, it was always directly related to post-traumatic stress and meant something that would trigger a serious psychological or physiological response, such as a flashback, which again is so much more than just remembering a difficult time, but rather a feeling of actually being back there. The best way to get people to understand the difference is often by using the example of war trauma. Most people understand that a soldier who fought in Vietnam and was forever changed by the experience might have a problem if someone unexpectedly let off some random fireworks. We understand that what's happening is not simply an unpleasant memory surfacing, but an entire embodied reaction. Depending on the person, that may be more or less obvious, but regardless, it will have a very real, very lasting impact. Of course, like we've already been talking about, war isn't the only source of this kind of life-altering trauma. Living under the constant threat of violence can do that to you too. So can things like childhood abuse, surviving a natural disaster, sudden and extreme loss. A trigger is not something that makes you feel upset or uncomfortable. It's something that provokes an embodied response which returns you to a traumatized state. It is horrible and really difficult to avoid because a lot of the time people's actual triggers aren't only the obvious things like someone looking like they're about to punch them, but subtle things that were present in the environment at the time too. A way to understand this, even if you haven't experienced this kind of trauma, is to think about scent memory. Have you ever been somewhere where you've suddenly encountered a particular scent and it's taken you straight back to another time in your life? A benign example from my own life is that when I was a teenager, one of my friends always used a particularly fragrant brand of shampoo. A couple of years ago, I ran out of my usual shampoo and just grabbed the first thing I saw in the supermarket, which happened to be the same one she used to use. When I put it on my hair in the shower, I felt really weird. Nice, but weird, because it was like she was suddenly there with me. These kinds of evocative memories can be pleasant, like remembering my friend, or sad if they remind you of a difficult time or of someone who's died. But they can also be triggers in the literal re-traumatizing sense, and Cecilia's recent experience is ripe for those. What kinds of things might trigger her? A non-exhaustive list I made during the film includes realizing she's sitting with her back to a window, heavy rain, bending down to pick something up when she's standing next to her car, being locked in anywhere, someone else having keys to her home, the specific creak of a floorboard that sounds like the one Adrian stood on in Sydney's bedroom when he was invisible, making the same breakfast she was making when Adrian tried to set the kitchen on fire, needing to go into an attic for any reason, text messages or a phone buzzing, hospitals. If you look through the script that accompanies this recording, you'll see that I've put that final one in capital letters. Hospitals. Because medical trauma is a real thing. If you've never been inside a psych ward, congratulations. If you have, even as a visitor, you'll know that on the whole they're not happy places. If you have a history of trauma which shows up on your medical record, you unfortunately might also be aware that some doctors will treat you like you're crazy, even if you go to see them for something purely physical. And by crazy, I mean the societally understood sense of the word, which includes things like incapable of understanding what's going on around you, combined with being kind of stupid. Neither of which is actually true of people who have mental health problems. Even people who live with episodes of psychosis are often smart, capable human beings a lot of the time. It's yet another way people draw barriers to make themselves feel safe, by labelling certain people as crazy and then defining crazy as less than. Non-crazy people can then tell themselves they're definitely fine and basically immune to anything bad ever happening. Which is bullshit, of course, but it's very tempting bullshit. Cecilia's psych ward admission will be on her medical file. So will her prior hospital visit, in which she was found to have high levels of diazepam in her blood. If she is particularly unlucky, the person who called her to tell her that might also have noted down that Cecilia seemed unaware of that diazepam. She might have incurred a diagnosis of PTSD if she's been seen since surviving the end of the film, or of depression from while she was still with Adrian. All of these things can lead to doctors not taking you seriously. But she's justified, I hear you cry. She wasn't psychotic. It was proven to be an invisible person by the end of the movie. Yeah, I know. But, and I'm speaking from a UK NHS context experience here, but I'd assume it's similar in the US and elsewhere, when a medic accesses a patient's chart, they're not going to read through reams and reams of pages. They're probably going to look at the bit right at the top, which says something like current medications and conditions, followed by significant history. That's there to tell them, for example, that this person has a surgical plate in their body and therefore can't have an MRI scan. But it's rarely properly up to date, especially in complicated circumstances like Cecilia's, and that means someone accessing her file might just see something like CAS, Cecilia, depression, PTSD, history of inpatient psychiatric treatment, resistance to psychiatric treatment, recent abortion at 8 weeks, psychosis, delusions. Looking at that, a medical professional might not take Cecilia seriously when she comes in with, for example, symptoms of perimenopause, a weird mark or changing mole on her skin, persistent pain in one or more parts of her body. Basically, anything she presents with that isn't immediately obvious might now be viewed as all in her mind because her trauma history is up front for all to see. Of course, she might get a really good doctor who actually takes her seriously, bothers to look at her notes, and sends her for treatment. But even so, it's probably going to be difficult for her to navigate medical appointments, especially in a hospital setting. Having been incarcerated in a psych ward for no good reason, Cecilia might have a pretty strong reaction to having to go into a hospital at all. Plenty of people who have been there for the death of a loved one hate the smell of hospitals and the specific look the rooms and corridors have, let alone people who have been locked up there involuntarily. During her psych ward stay, Cecilia was violently restrained by staff and injected with a sedative. She might therefore find it difficult to lie down and relax if she goes for an ECG, where someone looms over you and sticks wires all over your body, or to put her feet in stirrups for a gynae exam, which reduces her control, not to mention the reaction she might suddenly start having to being given injections. If you're interested in how medical trauma intersects with other traumas, I talk a lot about it from my own experiences on my Substack, a link to which you can find in the show notes. For now, suffice it to say that Cecilia's medical life is unlikely to be easy, and this might ironically end up working against her even more, in that she's probably going to stay away from doctors as much as possible, meaning that by the time she eventually does go to see one, the likelihood of her needing to go to hospital will probably be quite high. Overall, though, I'd say our final girl in this movie does okay in life, probably, but with certain caveats. And I've completely ignored the fact that the press would be all over this story if they got wind of it, and that would undoubtedly have had all sorts of effects of its own. Still, a more positive outcome than last time. But what do you think? The Invisible Man was directed by Leigh Whannell and came out in 2020. Our final girl Cecilia was played brilliantly by Elizabeth Moss. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at ThatFinalGirlLife or send an email to thatfinalgirllife@gmail.com. Support the podcast on patreon.com/thatfinalgirllife. The free tier gets you 2 episodes per month, the paid tier gets you 4. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember, the horrors persist, but so do we.